Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a grey horse in pastels. Now the tips and techniques that I'm going to share in this video can be applied when drawing any lighter hair or fur. Now before I get onto that, the first aim of any portrait once I've done the background is I do like to get the eye drawn in. This I want to make sure is pretty much completed before I work on any other element. Now this of course is where the main emotion stems from, so I do want to be making sure that I've got the shape of the eye right, the reflections and all of my tonal values. Now this is where contrast plays a huge part. You can see that the reflection in the top of the eye is nice and bright, but I'm building up the darker tones of the outer structure of that eye to really give it that three-dimensional shape. Now what I decided to do for this portrait is work just with my pastel pencils. I've got lots of tutorials where I work with PanPastels or a sanded soft pastel stick method, which I used before I switched over to my PanPastels, and all of these options give you the same outcome. But I do like to get a nice variety both on Patreon and on YouTube, where I can show that it doesn't matter what supplies you have, you can still create very photorealistic portraits. Now the one thing that I talk about in all tutorials is the importance of layers. Now as I work through this portrait you can really see just how many layers that I'm applying. The most important thing here is we don't jump into our brightest highlights first. Now I am working with a slightly different layering process, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the video. I do approach lighter fur, lighter hair in a different way. So to ensure that I don't go too dark, I'm working with more of a lighter base layer and then building up my darker values from there. When I'm working with this, I'm still making sure not to apply those final details that look like they're sat on top first. They still need to be left more for the last layers, but I am looking at this in a slightly different way than if I was drawing something with darker hair or darker fur. Now to show this layering process in depth, I have created this tutorial here in the corner of this grey dapple horse, and that's available on my Patreon now. It is all in real time, there are no sections sped up or cut out. You get the reference photo, line art and full material list. Now that has a beautiful backlit glow, and that there, the lighting and the contrast, all the things that I'm focusing on here for this portrait as well, are all explained thoroughly. That layering process is so important. So if you would like to watch that in-depth tutorial, then I will link my Patreon in the description below. So as well as the layering process, the pencil technique is also really important. So the way that we use the pencil, the amount of pressure we're applying, how sharp the lead should be, even down to where we're holding that pencil, are all going to affect the desired pencil stroke. And this is really important because the pencil technique is what determines the type of fur or hair texture that we're capturing in our drawing. And regardless if it's short hair or long fur, the three main things when I work with pencil technique that I feel make a real difference to that portrait are fur direction, fur length and fur thickness. Now this is something that I talk about in all of my tutorials here on YouTube, but I do have a video here on YouTube where it's focusing on my top tips for drawing realistic fur in pastels. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But the hair or fur direction is something that really does affect the overall shape of that animal's face. Now when we're working with pet portraits, this is something to pay very close attention to. If we put too much of an angle on some of our pencil strokes, maybe they're a little bit too flat, we're going to be completely changing the shape of the skull. Now this is also going to come into consideration when we're putting in our highlights and our shadows. So you can see here how I'm adding my additional highlighted layers on top, but I'm being really careful at where I'm adding those highlighted details. This is also the same with my shadows. Now the highlights and shadows, just like the fur direction, are not random. They follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. So if we alter that in any way, that portrait will not resemble the reference photo and therefore that pet as much as it should. So the pencil technique with those three things is so important. Now the fur thickness with those pencil strokes is going to be determined by a couple of things, one of which will be the pressure that we apply to the pencil. The more pressure you apply, the thicker your line is going to be, especially if you're working on a textured paper. Now in terms of paper, it's one of the more common questions I'm asked, and which surface do I like using when working with pastels. Now without a doubt, That for me is Pastelmat by Clairefontaine. It allows a huge number of layers. I've never got to the point where I have filled the tooth of the paper, and if I wanted to, I could carry on even at this stage and add in loads more. The amount of depth therefore that allows us to create is something that I've never found yet in another paper. And this brings me on to a question that I'm also asked on social media quite a lot, and it is how to avoid filling the tooth of the paper. Now if you build up your layers as I am here, nice subtle gradual layers, building up that process slowly, this will prevent filling the tooth of the paper because we're not flooding that surface with loads of pastel early on. Now you'll know if you filled the tooth of the paper because the details that you're trying to create won't show up, and it's almost like that pencil will just glide over the surface. Now if that happens, you've got a couple of things that you can do. You can try using some softer pencils like your Derwent or your Caran. They may be able to just grip the last bit of texture on that surface, but it is going to limit how many details and how many layers you can put on top. The other is you could apply a workable fixative. Now I don't like working with fixatives because they can really ruin the artwork. They can change the colour and the values, your lights and your darks. So it can make a portrait look really dull. However, if you're not finished with that portrait and you are adding more layers on top, then that's not so much of an issue because you can adjust the colour, but I wouldn't recommend to use it if you've pretty much finished that portrait. Now if you are filling the tooth of the paper and you're using something like PanPastels for your base application, then the application of that pastel is too thick. Now when you're using PanPastels, this is something that I focus heavily in my Patreon tutorials because the pigment is so soft, it's far easier to fill the tooth of the paper early on. But as long as you apply the PanPastels in the correct manner, you won't fill the tooth of the paper and you can carry on layering as much as you like. Now I have a video here on YouTube and it really does focus on how to draw realistic leather in pastels. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But here I'm breaking it up into my main shapes and then my lights and my darks. Once I've got the highlights and shadows in place, you can see that's where I really refine and add the details on top. So I definitely would recommend here to break it up into very small chunks, even if you have to do one leather strap at a time as I am here. Now one of the questions that I'm also asked is, why do I work in such small sections rather than individual layers over the entire subject? Now there is no right or wrong answer for this, it's going to depend on each individual artist. But for me, I like to try and break it up into small chunks so that I don't become overwhelmed by any one section. If you feel like you're hesitating quite a lot, it's probably because you're working on too much of a larger area. Now the other thing to bear in mind as well is this was only about an 8x12 size portrait, so it's not huge, and the horse is mainly on one side of the portrait given the angle of the photograph. So the size of those leather straps are quite small. If you compare it here to the size of the pencil, there's not a huge amount of room to add the tiny details on the leather straps, but we can certainly hint at a really high level of photorealism by making sure that the contrast, the lights and the darks are accurate. Now one big tip when you're working on a lighter coloured horse like I am here, and you are asked to draw in the bridle, which is often a darker colour, I would always recommend to put in the rest of the horse's face in first, like I'm doing here. The reason being, if I'd have put the bridle in and that's therefore got a lot of my darker tones, and then I add the lighter colours of the horse, if I accidentally then drag those pencils over to the darker bridle section and some of that darker pigment becomes mixed in with my lighter layers for the horse, I'm going to end up with muddying up of my colours. And this is something that can happen when you're working up against one area that's light and one area that's dark. So this is just something to pay really close attention to. Now when you are working on animals like this is where a bit of pre-planning always makes the drawing process easier. So here you can see now that I've got all of the areas of the horse in around this bridle and the nose band, I can now go in with my dark pencils and not have to worry about contaminating any of my lighter values either side of it. So this here is just a really nice way of working, and with pastels we have that ability to layer the darks over lights and the lights over darks. But because I want to make sure that I've got my contrast right and the lighter values of this horse nice and bright, I didn't want any of that darker pastel to come into contact with those layers. Now when it comes to drawing horse muzzles or horse noses, this here is where I break it up again into small chunks, but I'm also just focusing on the shapes that I can see. By putting in my shapes first and then adding my lights and my darks on top, I don't ever become overwhelmed, or I look at that reference photo and think, where should I start? Because quite often, depending on how the horse is breathing, the sort of bridle, this here has that extra strap down by the mouth. This here is going to potentially affect the way that the mouth shape is. So all of this is going to vary from one photo to the next. So if we break that up into just the shapes we can see for that one photograph, it's going to be easier to tackle. Now, one thing with this sort of element, and something that can really help, is if you turn your artwork upside down and your reference photo upside down, your brain will be forced to see that for the abstract shapes rather than, in this case, a horse's muzzle. So that's something that can really help. You'll find that then when you finish that section and you turn everything back up the right way, that it looks far more accurate than it did before. Now, earlier on in this tutorial, I mentioned about the importance of making sure your highlights and shadows are in the right place. Now, this here is also very important in terms of where the metal pieces are for the bridle. You can see that in between the center loop, there is a darker shadow, and this is where that metal ring is casting a shadow onto the skin underneath. So without this shadow here, this bridle will not look like it's sat on top. So now at this stage, I'm going to have to start drawing the neck of the horse. The reason being, although I haven't finished the bridle, the neck is behind the rein that's attached to that metal ring of the bit. So in order to make sure that I've shown that, and again to make sure that my darks don't mix in with my lights, I'm going to have to draw the neck first. So this is where I'm studying that photograph and making sure that I'm working on the correct element at the right layer. Now once I'm happy with this, that's when I can finish off the bridle. Now there you've seen all of a sudden there was an extra section of lighter pastel on the background. All I used there was my white PanPastel just to apply a very thin layer of that over the top to really reinforce the glow of my background. And if you've seen many of my pet portraits that I've got here on YouTube, you'll know that I like to put those glow effect backgrounds where I've got a lighter centre and a darker vignette effect on the edges. Now this effect is something that I had quite a lot of questions about when I first started uploading to YouTube. So I do have 3 videos on Patreon that show how to create that vignette effect with multiple mediums. So I've got one for soft pastel sticks, I've got 1 or 2 for PanPastels, but showing how you can apply them in different ways depending on how soft you want that effect. So if that's of interest, as well as any of my other in-depth tutorials, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. So I do hope the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video have been useful. If they were, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload 2 to 3 videos here to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then hit the subscribe and the bell button. And if you would like to draw along to the grey dapple horse tutorial that I've got on Patreon that I showed earlier on in this video, then I will link my Patreon in the description below. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube in the next few days, and as always, thank you so much for watching.